Since the Chevy Corvette first debuted in 1953, the formula has remained as unchanged as it is sacred. A plethora of potent ponies up front, roasting rubber in the rear. However, Chevy, like a Motorhead Moses, has descended from the mount with a new set of commandments for us, the petroleum pagans. So as the sun sets on the 7th day, so it shall rise on the 8th. And on the 8th day, God created the mid-engined Chevrolet Corvette. He looked down upon his creation and saw that it was controversial.
Yeah.
This is Geek Therapy Radio.
What are we waiting for?
And now your mental curator, Johnny Hamburger.
But is it? Let's take a look at the history leading to the mid-engined 2020 Chevy Corvette. Chevy borrowed the term Corvette from maritime warfare. A corvette is a small warship often used to escort and defend larger ships. However, ask anyone to define Corvette and they will undoubtedly describe the car. People who don't know about cars know that a Corvette is the sports car. Ask car people to define a Corvette, and they'll describe it as exclusively and even defiantly front engine and rear wheel drive. For nearly 70 years, to suggest mounting the engine behind the driver has been considered automotive sacrilege of the highest order. To suggest it seriously among some circles could be met with gearhead excommunication, banished forever from the sacred saints of cylinders. However, despite such devotion among the devout among us, Chevy has been dabbling with a mid-engine Corvette as early as a mere 6 years after initial production. That's right, the first mid-engine Corvette was conceived in 1959, codenamed XP719. The first mid-engine Corvette was designed by Larry Shinoda. Some argue that this is a rear-engine design. However, looking closely at the photo, a strong argument can be made that the engine actually lies in front of the rear axle, making it truly mid-engined. Now, Chevy later conceived a Corvair-esque true rear-engine design, but that's beyond the scope of this episode. After 1959, Chevy constantly dabbled, designed, and even built several mid-engine Corvette concepts. Next was in 1964 with the Serv 2, that's C-E-R-V. The mid-engine motivation was mostly spurred on by European offerings. The Corvette, arguably, was America's best true sports car. Sure, there were plenty of muscle cars like the Mustang or even the Corvette's sister, the Pontiac GTO, but no true international racers to compete with European offerings like Ferrari and Lamborghini. The Corvette was the closest match on this side of the pond, and Chevy had a hard time keeping up with Europe's mid-engined stable. Just 4 years later, in 1968, was the XP-880, also known as the Astro 2. This was Chevy's first try at a production-focused mid-engine Corvette using readily available off-the-shelf parts from General Motors' existing inventory. Lead designer Zora Arkus Duntov pushed hard for the XP-880 to become the C4 Corvette, but it was ultimately given the thumbs down by GM bean counters. Then just 2 years later, in 1970, the XP-882 was set up to go against the mid-engined Di Tommaso Pantera, among other competitors. Response to the XP-882 was so wonderful that GM decided to hold off and develop a more radical rotary engine version, which of course didn't exactly pan out. 2 years after that came the XP-895 in 1972. In an ironic twist, this Reynolds Corvette was never sold because the current C3 was selling so well that Chevy didn't want to mess with the design. Now, I'm going to speed things up here. There were so many mid-engine Corvettes that this episode could go on for at least an hour. And that's my point. Chevy wanted the Corvette to be a mid-engine sports car since the late 1950s, but for various reasons, never pulled the trigger. So here's the rest of the mid-engine Corvette list. The 1973 XP-897 GT was shelved by the oil crisis. The 897 GT used a rotary engine, and rotary engines are not fuel efficient. Also in 1973 was the four-rotor Corvette that was so terrible to drive, GM canned it. Then in 1976 came perhaps the most iconic mid-engine Corvette prototype, the Aerovette. It sported a conventional V8, amazing styling, and awesome gull-wing doors. So, as a DeLorean owner, I'm partial to gull-wing doors. Forgive me. The Aerovette was praised by the public as well as critics. It was a great car, people loved it and wanted it, but to be blunt, Chevy was too afraid of messing with the currently available long-running C3. That's twice at least so far that Chevy had a great mid-engine Vette on their hands, only to shelve them out of pressure from bean counters. So far, by my count, we would have had mid-engine Corvettes for over 50 years with the original 1968 XP880 Astro II, but let's move on. The 1986 Corvette Indy was far too advanced to be profitable. It would have been insanely expensive and would have eliminated a massive Corvette consumer base. Then in 1990, Chevy debuted the Serve 3. Again, this would have been vomit-inducingly expensive, as much in fact as a Ferrari F40 at around $400,000 or about $800,000 in today's money. And for the most part, that actually brings us to today in the 2020 mid-engine Corvette. After knowing how long Chevy has been working on mid-engine Corvettes, is the change so controversial? I submit that there's a strong argument to be made that this is what Chevy intended since the first concept in 1959. In other words, this is what Chevy has been working towards all along. This is what the Corvette was intended to be nearly since inception. One could argue that the controversy is that Chevy didn't have the ball bearings to release it sooner. Of course, one could also argue that Chevy's timidness to release a mid-engine Corvette gave the public decades to become familiar and fall in love with the front-engine formula. But only time will tell, and by time, I mean sales. Part of me feels like the 2020 Corvette is going to be insanely popular. I feel this way because I previously could care less about Corvettes. But now I'm super excited about the 2020 Corvette. I think a mid-engined American sports car that rivals the Germans and Italians for a fraction of the price will likely be a winner. A big winner. But again, it doesn't entirely matter what I think. The DeLorean is my favorite car in the world, and it'll get wasted by a Prius. The market is the great decider. But until the 2020 Corvette is offered for sale, until we see it on the road, all we can do is speculate, drool, or perhaps turn a nose up to the whole idea. That's where you come in. If you're watching this on YouTube, let her rip in the comments below. And if you're listening to the podcast, go to the Geek Therapy Radio Facebook page and let me know what you think about the 2020 Corvette. At any rate, thanks for listening and watching. If you consider liking and subscribing, that'd be awesome. I know you don't have to, so I'd greatly appreciate even the consideration. I'm pushing for 1,000 subs here in 2019, so any help would warm my geek heart. Take care and be good to each other, including yourself. And as always, remember to embrace your inner geek. You are not alone.